This is Long Live the Queen, a Wisteria podcast. I'm your host, Dorian LeBlanc, and today we are pleased and honored to be sitting down with luminary Mark Hart. If you've played Ballistica, Spite Golf, Masquerade, or Collusion, then you're familiar with his work under the name Reiner Bauza. But even if you haven't, you've seen Wisteria, and his possibility engine is a part of the underlying magic of the game itself. Welcome, Mark.
Great to be here, Dorian.
So we understand that Collusion is now available on our personal devices. Is that true?
Yeah. It just came out the other day.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, for the few people listening who haven't already experienced Collusion, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the game itself, just from the player perspective.
Yeah, so it's what you might call a social deduction game, where you have a role, and you may have a hidden role. And it's a game of courtly intrigue, and everyone in the game has a different objective. A lot of the objectives center around sort of a mysterious bastard heir. One of the players is the bastard heir, and that's generated randomly every time, and everyone knows, and the heir doesn't themselves know that they are the heir, but everyone knows a fact about the heir that would help identify. And so, there's different characters. There's a faction that wants to put any heir forward. There's a faction that wants to find the real heir and assassinate it. And there's other groups with other goals.
Oh, this sounds like a lot of fun. And of course, a game designer as experienced as you can, of course, appreciate that the way the game develops on our personal devices, maybe with our casual friends, is very different from the way that it's developed and evolved in the world of Wisteria, where it's actually quite popular in certain circles.
Yeah, the Duke, my patron. I should say Reiner Bauza's patron. My character's patron. Is fond of his collusion parties, and in fact, part of my patronage agreement is to create new variants and scenarios for collusion, and those actually will be available after they appear in Wisteria on the version for your personal devices.
Oh, that'll be extra fun for all of us playing along in our homes, as it were. So Collusion has a pretty interesting history. Like most successful game designers, you have an extensive ludography, I guess is the term of art. But Collusion in particular was one of the ways that you first formed a relationship with Harrison Kelly, one of the primary designers of Wisteria, of course.
Right.
And according to my research, she had some input into the design of Collusion, or maybe it was just that she was she lobbied you to have it be included in Wisteria. Can you tell us a little bit about the making of Collusion and Kelly's role in bringing it to fruition?
That's interesting. Harrison and I were playing a lot of, I ran, in the early days of Wisteria, I ran a D&D campaign with Harrison and Diana as players and a few other folks.
Wait. Diana and Harrison in a D&D game together. That's fascinating. That must have been, oh my goodness, what a piece of history.
Yeah, it was. So, all right, I can talk a little about that. Diana's character, she was like a half-elven bard, sort of like the tropiest bardy bard of all bards, right? And her thing was like, if she had her way, the players would never have left the tavern. They'd just be there cracking jokes and getting up to antics and hitting on barmaids. And I am not the dungeon master for your barmaid hitting on experience. Like, if you want that experience, I'm not that guy, right? And Harrison would be very quiet during that stuff. And her character, she was like a multi-classed sorcerer, warlock, I think, draconic sorcerer, hexblade warlock, and I think she chose tiefling as a race just for the stats, but she had like an 11-page backstory, and she was always the one. She would laugh and have fun when they were doing this sort of like antics in town, but she was always the one who was sort of like, come on, let's be heroic, let's go on this quest that Mark has set for us, and all of that stuff. So some of some of Collusion came out of sort of the intrigue from within that. Some of Collusion came out with our sort of other, playings of, Werewolf and Among Us and Mafia and, the social deduction games of the day. But we thought that, sort of this kind of Wisteria-esque courtly intrigue might be a really good fit, within Wisteria. And it was interesting because the Bauza interpretation of Collusion became kind of a Roman a clef for the court itself. And I think that is the source of its popularity, honestly. That not only did the sort of aristocracy enjoy playing it, but they sort of enjoyed playing in and around each other, if you will, as personalities.
I think that the different perspectives you bring to gaming within Wisteria, gaming outside of Wisteria, and the history of the game itself, as well as the history of gaming itself, is something I want to come back to maybe a few different times in this conversation. But first, let me take a couple questions from the feed here and maybe go on a few tangents with you. Banana writes in, so much effort seems to go into hiding game mechanics from the player in a game like Wisteria, as opposed to something like Masquerade, where the visibility and unpredictability of those mechanics is the fun. For you, is one task more interesting than the other?
Oh, that's interesting. So is it more interesting to design games where the mechanics are kind of at arm's length from the player's perception? Blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I generally prefer the more kind of in-your-face approach that a game like Masquerade takes, or a game like even Collusion takes. There's always, but you're always trying to even when they're beneath the surface, you're always trying to surface them in some ways, right?
I have this.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I have the sense that the presentation of the game and the structure of the game probably inform each other on a much more deep level for a designer than they would for a casual player, and that you probably see them as two sides of the same coin, perhaps more than most.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? There's different kinds of players, right? Like at some point you are designing for connoisseurs who are a different beast in that they are there to appreciate the construction of the thing as much as the thing. And that's very different from designing for sort of a more naive player.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I've got a question about the possibility engine, but before I get into it, maybe you can give us just a quick layman's overview of what it is. I understand, of course, that there are certain agreements that prevent you from talking about certain details, but just if you can give us sort of a high-level sense of what it is and how it functions in Wisteria.
So, in an abstract, like, games are explorations of alternate possibilities, right? Like, even if you're playing a game like chess, right? Like, every move that you didn't make, right, is an alternate possibility for that game of chess, right? And if you are, when you're playing, right, you're thinking ahead, right? There's the possibility that's on the table, and then there's all the possibilities that you're exploring in your mind as you try alternate moves, right? And if you're going to write an AI that plays chess, right, you have to explicitly explore those possibilities. Now, a game like chess is relatively simple. You can store a chess game in just a few bytes, and so making a lot of copies of a lot of chess games isn't like a big deal. But when you get to a game like Wisteria or a game like World of Warcraft, or something that has just like a vast and expansive amount of state, you need some way to organize and navigate. You can't just copy the whole world, right? Like you can't. You need some way to organize and navigate all of the different possibilities. So the possibility engine is sort of a memory representation of, sort of multifarious game states that, doesn't do pure copying. And so one of the things that it happens to be very good at is measuring the proximity between different possible worlds. Like, how different is this world from that world? And so the thing that it's used for in Wisteria is, sort of as this aggregator that allows, 1,000 players to play one character. It's mediating. It's trying to find the possibility of minimum distance between all of the ideas that the players are generating.
As someone who's been fortunate to play Wisteria myself a number of times, I've always found that aspect of the game just quite indescribable, magical. This notion that I can have a very personal experience that I understand intellectually I'm sharing with some people, even though it really, I would expect for that experience to be jarring and to have things happen that are really outside my expectation, and yet that's not the experience at all. Everything feels quite natural, and I'm inferring from what you're saying that the possibility engine is a large part of why that's able to happen, and to allow that suspension of disbelief to continue such that you can really sink into the experience.
Yeah, it's a big part.
Yeah. So we've had novelists on the cast before, and we've gotten into the ways authors invest in their characters. So as a game designer, Mark, one imagines that you invest yourself in games, not only their presentation, but also their implementation. So I wonder, are you pleased by the evolution of the possibility engine as realized by Wisteria? How has it met or exceeded your expectations, or maybe gone off the path originally envisioned by you, its designer?
Well, there are a lot of potential applications for games that I think we're not seeing from the possibility engine due to it being proprietary. And so, yeah, it does clearly a lot of work in Wisteria, but it isn't. It is in some sense like the secret sauce of the. The secret sauce of the participation element of Wisteria, but it's not, it's not driving the story in any sense. It's not really part of the game design. It's really more of like the tech, the engine that the game runs on. So I don't really feel like, I don't consider myself a design contributor to Wisteria. I consider myself a technology contributor to Wisteria, if that makes any sense.
It does. So that makes me wonder if this analogy rings true or maybe falls flat for you. It almost sounds as though you've in the possibility engine, you've designed a game that Wisteria is a player of, and there could be other players of the game.
Oh,
and the experience of these players playing the game give rise to certain narratives that are helped by the engine, but aren't created by the engine in a direct way in the way the players are. Does that ring true?
Sure. I mean, it is. Another example is earlier in my career, I worked on sort of television presentation AI for sports games. Right.
Okay.
So I built the system that, when a sports game, you're playing a sports game on your console back in the day, and something happens, and then you're going to see you're going to hear commentators say stuff, you're going to see overlays on the screen, all of those things. And I built the engine that sort of like decides what all of those television-y kind of things, in the old school television-y kind of things happen. But that was, I didn't build the part that actually understands sports, right? I built the part that enables people who are experts at sports to actually express, all of the ideas of, if the play results in a touchdown, then probably we're going to want to see a replay, those kinds of things, right? So it is really more like a tech and content relationship than it is, I would say, a game and player relationship, if that's fair.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate the distance you're putting between yourself and sort of the design aspects of Wisteria. I'm still going to read this question here from Foo Proof, who writes in on the feed. Has working in games like Wisteria affected your ontological or spiritual views, or vice versa?
Oh, I'd expect my ontological or spiritual views. I had a conversion from Platonism to constructivism as a part of a process of working on games. I went from a world where math and to a lesser degree science is a worldview where those things are discovered to a world where those things are invented. And I think part of that is sort of like, sort of being in the weeds where you're kind of inventing these formal structures all the time. And that's probably the closest thing I've had to a sort of deep philosophical shift.
Well, maybe we can get into that in a little more detail. So since we're talking about world building on a deep level, so as we mentioned before, your research and your work has resulted in many games, including casual games like Ballistic and Spike Golf, much deeper games like Masquerade and Collusion, which of course, especially those last two, touch on identity itself. Now, the culmination of at least part of that work is the Possibility Engine, of course, which you licensed to Wisteria, as we've been talking about. Now, when I play chess, as you mentioned before, I'm me, but in some sense I play the role of the king. And when I play, in some sense, when I play an old school RPG, you brought up D&D earlier, right? There's a backstory there, and the identity in some sense goes deeper. In Wisteria, it goes a level deeper still. Right. There's a suspension of disbelief that that is no longer it's no longer within your control while you're playing the game, right? The suspension of disbelief is in some sense impressed on you. So my question is, in your view, is there a level of personal identity that exists below gaming, or is all identity mutable? In other words, like, is there the possibility of a game going so deep that it touches on or even below your identity level, or is there always a you playing a game no matter how rich the game is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, game design in some sense is about subtraction, right? Like, you mentioned the chess example. When I'm I'm sort of playing a king. Well, you're playing a king who, doesn't have to, have someone taste his food, and doesn't have to, pour over tax receipts, and doesn't have to, negotiate with his vassals and all of those things, right? So in some sense, like, chess is about, delivering to you the fantasy of being a king to the extent that chess does, but it's subtracting out, all of these, other things, right? It's trying to create. It's really trying to evoke royalty. It's not trying to mimic royalty or simulate royalty. Like, another example is, if I made a game about driving a race car, and the game was so authentic, quote unquote, that you actually had to have all of the skills of a professional race car driver, right, to actually play the game. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, playing the game was just as dangerous as, driving a race car. Then is that really a game about driving a race car, or is that just driving a race car, right? Like, the game designer's job is to, like, subtract parts of that experience, right? Like the danger and the skill curve, and give you something that evokes, what you even imagine is like, because you don't know what it's like to drive a race. Probably, I don't know what it's like to drive a race car, right? So, like, if someone put me in a race car driving game and had me drive a race car, I wouldn't know how authentic it is, right? So the game is, it's subtracting. It's subtracting whatever it's a simulacrum of, or subtracting pieces out. And Wisteria is a weird case, right? Because what does it subtract? I mean, in some sense, it, like, subtracts you, right? It subtracts your self, your sense of selfness, like, while you're playing it. I mean, you kind of get it back at the end, but I don't know. Is that like I have a hard time like thinking of Wisteria as a game.
I was going to bring that up.
You know, like is it a game or like do you even play it or does it play you? I don't have a really handle on that. So I think of it, you know, in my thinking, like Wisteria is a platform, right? Like my use of Wisteria is, you know, I go to Wisteria and I design games and I make games, and it's great for my academic research because like here's a chance to embrace the counterfactual, right? Like we don't get to live in the world where like early on in the evolution of basketball they banned dribbling, right? Like we don't get to live in that counterfactual world. But here is a whole counterfactual world where you can see similar things play out differently, and that's kind of what's in it for me, both as a game designer and as a researcher, that I find fascinating.
Well, I've noted that Wisteria has, as I was looking into this question, I've noticed that Wisteria not only bills itself as an experience rather than a game,
right,
but to my eye has gone to some lengths to distance itself from the notion of game in order to lean into ideas like experience. And I'm beginning to wonder if it's for this reason that you mentioned, that games are in their essence subtractive, and Wisteria clearly has an additive component. Right. There is an entire world that isn't simply our world missing some stuff. It's an entirely new construction in some ways. Right. And maybe that puts it outside the realm of games entirely.
And an entirely new you in some ways, right? Like
Yeah, and that's why I get into the question about identity, right? And so maybe the question of whether games can subsume identity is not the right question. The question is whether Wisteria or other experiences like it can. And of course, maybe that's just an open question by design.
Well, going back to D&D for a second, a friend of mine, Andrew Leaker, who's sort of a cult figure within tabletop gaming, he designed Skyrealms with Joe Ruin back in the day. He told me something that I always found fascinating, which is that, you know, most people, you know, this is talking about old school tabletop role playing. Most people think of these games as you put on a mask and you become someone else, right? But what really happens most of the time is you put on the mask and you become your real self, right? The mask, you know, sort of like is this inhibitor that lets you behave the way you really always wanted to, rather than most people don't end up really exploring, you know, other identities. They're really sort of actually looking inward when they're playing. And I think I kind of saw that in the game I ran with Diana and Harrison. You know, Diana, really the mask was about like, okay, I'm not a coworker anymore. I'm not a boss. You know, I'm not, you know, someone you're beholden to. I'm just, you know, this is my excuse to be just the purely social version of Diana. Whereas, you know, in some ways, I think, you know, Harrison, when she was in the D&D game, I feel like, you know, I almost like that may have been the only time I've sort of like witnessed the real her, if that makes any sense, you know, because
well, that actually touches on a question I've been wanting to ask, but I wasn't quite sure how to get into it, and that's a really great opening for me. So you've gamed with Diana and Harrison, and of course it's common knowledge that before her coma, Harrison was acting in a less and less outwardly stable way. Since you've talked about games being an opportunity for people to sort of reveal their real selves in some sense, right? To the mask as true, I'm wondering if you can see any echoes of Harrison in the game itself. I'm not asking this clearly as perhaps I should, but I've always felt that there is a genius in Wisteria that to my mind borders on madness, simply because it's so deeply immersive that I can't conceive of how it would happen. And I can't help wondering if maybe that's, obviously it's a reflection of Harrison personally, as a professional, right? Obviously it was her goal to make this incredibly immersive experience. But I wonder if you have any special insight into how Harrison Kelly as a person may have been temperamentally the only person who could create a universe like this, or is it just craft, executed very well? As a layman, I can't tell the difference, but perhaps as an expert and someone who knew her personally, maybe you have some insights into some of these thoughts.
There's craft there, definitely. But there's also... I'm not going to call it talent. I think it's more about worldview. I think it's Wisteria demands when you enter, right? It demands that you pass through the veil, the membrane that leaves yourself behind, and that for those moments you totally commit, right? And I think that this idea of total commitment, that's sort of like the essence of sort of Harrison's view of like what Wisteria should be. That you leave leave everything behind. And she was
in some sense more real than real.
Yeah. Or stranger than fiction or something. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Mark. Pulling away maybe from some of these deeper topics, we have a question here from Two-Handed Fraudsword, who writes in on the feed. I heard you worked on an open world reboot of Desert Bus under a pseudonym. Is this true, and will there be different buses?
To the first question, no comment.
I thought the probability engine would be the sensitive part of our discussion. That's fascinating. Go on.
To the second question, almost certainly.
Well, Two-Headed Fraudsword, you've drawn out Mark Hart. That's certainly good to hear. I just want to give you an invitation here, Mark, if there's anything, closing thoughts that you want to leave with here before I give you another plug on some of your recent works.
No. This has been really fun, Dorian.
I'm really glad to hear it. It's been, like I say, it's been just a pleasure and an honor to have you on. I'd like to remind everyone that Collusion is now available on personal devices. You should, of course, begin playing immediately. Such a pleasure to have Mark Hart here as a guest on Long Live the Queen. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Oh, great to be here.